Now, it's not meant for first person, but it does work. Moving into devices right now, you want to start out with the input trigger. This one's called standing, okay? Then this one's called stand trigger. And this one's called stand. Likewise, this is crouching. And this is crouch trig. And this is crouch. So, you want to make the creative input, custom 3, crouch. And here's the device settings. So, enable when receiving from crouch trig on trig. Wait. Yeah, okay. Enable when receiving from crouch trig on triggered. Disable when receiving from stand trig on triggered. Register player when receiving from team 2 spawner on player spawned. Now you don't have to have this, but it's much recommended, especially in multiplayer maps. On input pressed, send event to crouch trig enable. Stand trig trigger, and stand trig disable, so disable the trigger itself. Now moving on to crouching. So the crouching, likewise as the first one, enable when receiving from stand trig on triggered. Disable when receiving from crouch trig on triggered. Register player when receiving from team 2 spawner on player spawned. On input pressed, send event to crouch trig trigger. Crouch trig disable. Stand trig enable. Now moving on to the triggers. You want to make sure that these are set up right. If these are already here, you don't have to worry about it. On triggered, send event to stand add to player. Standing disable. Crouch remove from player. Crouching enable. Now on functions, enable when receiving from crouching on input pressed. Disable when receiving from standing on input pressed. Trigger when receiving from standing on input pressed. Moving on to the stand camera. Functions, add to player. Stand trig on trigger. Remove from player when receiving from crouch trig on triggered. Now these are basically mirrored, so you want to make sure that the crouching in crouch is crouch trig, then stand trig. So add a player when receiving from crouch trig on triggered on crouch. This will be stand trig on triggered. So it's basically mirrored, but different. It's kind of hard to explain actually. Okay, this is the standing settings. You can make the field of view whatever. It doesn't really matter. Just fit your style. Now you don't have to have the dead zone on, but I just use that so you can move your head freely a little bit. And the crouching is basically the same thing, but lowered by a little bit. In fact, I might make that a little bit lower. But yeah, you can start the game, and it should work perfectly fine. As you can see, there's a little bit of delay, but I have that for experimenting. You can turn that off somehow. Scout weapons do not work. It's a little complicated to work. Now, if you want to make the first-person multiplayer, you can just copy all these devices. And paste them. These will all be called 2 now. And these will be called 1. You might want to double check that these are all the right ones though. Make sure that all says 2 at the end. Because sometimes it does glitch for some reason. Because, you know, it's Fortnite Creative. And I highly recommend removing sliding, because that's super fucking buggy. Because the camera will get out of sync if you stop sliding.